Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. We are back. The main feed has been on hiatus for the last month or so, and I've been releasing episodes previously published on the Secret Show feed, which you can find at sleerickets.substack.com. There are new episodes there every week, and often it's slightly thornier or juicier or just more deranged material than on the main feed. Thank you to all of you who have joined in the past month, and you know come check it out if you have not already. It is pretty cheap, and as I've said before, and I haven't repeated recently, if you are interested in the Secret Show, but you're a starving artist, let me know if there's some financial question. People have written to me about that. We'll figure something out. It's also a great way you can support the main feed because I am doing this part all for free and enjoy it. And I'm glad to be back because I've actually got a lot to talk about. So I went to Cleveland. Elijah Blumoff, host of Versecraft, the Versecraft podcast, hosted a big reading event there. Ryan Wilson and George David Clark and I read, and I will have actually an episode with all of them as well as Brian Bridger on coming up soon. But it was a really fun event. But like a bunch of writers and poets and SLEERICKETS people, drove it. Some lived in Cleveland, some drove in from out of town. A partial list includes Ethan McGuire, his lovely wife Autumn, who made a long drive to both ways that day, and were just wonderful. It was wonderful to see them there. Also, good job, Ethan, because I talked to Matt Wall last night, and it sounds like Stasha did follow up with him. So we met a future intense Matt Wall fan, and Ethan had the brilliant idea of steering her toward him, but. Ethan, Autumn, Tim, Phil Metris, Elijah, Laura, Brian, Bridger, David, Clark, Ryan, Wilson, Bob Hass, not the Blackberries Bob Hass, but the good poet Bob Hass, and Stasha, and a number of other people. So that was really lovely. It was also I was skeptical of Elijah's plan to have the three of us read for a long time each with interruptions for questions, but then also have an extended Q&A, but then also have an open mic, and then also have a big group dinner afterward, and then also have an hour and a half recording session. But we did all that, and it was bizarre. It actually worked out great for everybody except for Phil Metris, who told his wife he would be gone for an hour. It was he was had to run out slightly early. It ended up actually being sort of what we teased it as, which is a kind of an improvisatory poetry conference. So it was lovely to meet and talk to so many people about poetry. There is also a recording of at least part of that evening you can find on YouTube. There's I think Elijah released it in two parts. The first one is about an hour 45 minutes. The second one is about 15. It includes a bunch of our readings and other people's readings and some lively Q&A and back and forth in between. And Elijah's mom, who she was just holding her iPhone up without even supporting her elbow with an eerie steadiness for hours on end. I'm a little bit unnerved by how immobile the iPhone picture is. Go check that out. I'll include links in the show notes to all of that. Also, just out yesterday is an episode of A Mouthful of Air, Mark McGinnis's poetry podcast. Mark came on SLEERICKETS some time ago to talk about poetic form as well as Mouthful of Air, and he's been doing that podcast now for maybe a couple years now. He's now expanded beyond just British poets. So he interviewed me. He had me on to talk about a poem from my book Midlife. And I followed the advice Joanna gave me, which is sort of my usual policy with these things, which is find an excuse to talk about something other than your own work. And so we did that. I mostly talked about Horace and Ryan Wilson, to whom the poem I read was dedicated. But it was a really fun conversation. Mark was terrific. And boy, that is a very professional podcast. So if you want to hear a really polished professional poetry podcast, go listen to A Mouthful of Air. I will include a link to that as well. So between that and some really good episodes of Poetry Says, Alice's podcast that have come out recently, and a thing. So my dad came into town with my stepmom. I had an exchange with him I'll get into in a minute, but then I also got a note from Zara saying that she wished I would talk more about my own poems. Don't worry, I'm not going to now give you a reading of poems, of my own poems, or talk about my autobiography, but it got me thinking about what is behind a lot of the poetry I write. And I think a lot of the poetry, like many or most poets I know write, which is to say, it is not simply, in most cases, a diaristic monologue. It is not all totally just face value narration of one's life, but it's also not, I think, fair to say that it's meant to be encrypted or a puzzle, or so like you have to be sophisticated in order to crack it open. Like when I was a kid, I remember my dad, showing me The Wasteland, and he talked about the various references in it and the allusions that Eliot was making to all of these other works of art, and even other languages sometimes. And I took, as I'm sure I'm not the only young bookish kid to take the message that, oh, well, what makes poetry good is that it's very allusive, that it has a bunch of references in it. And I think I held on to that as a kind of with a negative capability. I held on to that in my mind at the same time that I held on to the much vaguer, but I think truer notion that what makes poetry good is like sounding cool, which was also a goal of mine and remains more of a goal of mine than mere allusiveness does. But the allusiveness is, I think, like as with so many poetic figures and techniques that young people sometimes learn about, I think it is easy to mistake the frequency of allusion in poetry with a criterion for allusiveness in poetry. The reason that poets use various figures or techniques or methods is not because they are required. You don't use alliteration because alliteration is a thing poets use. You use these things in order to achieve certain effects. And with allusion, it's both an effect and a cause, I think. So the conversation I had really, and I do very much recommend, Alice had a wonderful conversation with Jonathan Farmer, my good friend, about his wonderful essay on, one of his, actually, he has a very new essay on Elizabeth Bishop, but he also has an essay in his book, That Peculiar Affirmative. They talked about that, as well as the book as a whole a little bit, and some other things. She gave me grief in the beginning of the episode because she said it would be a surreal thing for me to listen to, since I speak to her regularly from the other side of the world, but I also go to the bar with Jonathan regularly, as I did last night. Was it last night or the night before? I think maybe the night before. And it was surreal. It was also sort of hyper real because like they're both voices in my head, and so in a way it felt like it was just like a normal hour of thought in my own private mind. But that was very much worth listening to, as well as the most recent episode of Poetry Says, where Alice talks about Horace again, and specifically about Horace 4:1, which is a much translated ode of his, and one she has been working on a rendering of. I will return to that ode in particular, but boy, she's doing a whole different thing with this medium than I am, than most poetry podcasters I know are. She's really making poetry podcast art. It's like her editing is witty in a way, just requires a lot of skill. She's such a good editor, just at a technical level, and is. I'm not going to just suck Alice's dick right now, but it's a really good episode. It's worth listening to. It's just very beautifully made. But it also sort of set me on this track of chewing over the question of allusion. So what really prompted this most specifically, though, was a conversation with my dad. So he came up and he's read the book, which makes me grateful and slightly anxious. And then he's like reread it, which makes me even more anxious. And he said, "Oh, I have this question about a poem that's about me." And I instantly panicked. Like, oh fuck, what poem did I include in the book about him? What did it, I mean, like, I certainly like think about him. He's part of my life. But like, did I include a poem specifically about him? I don't remember that. What did I say? Oh God, was I not, like, I try not to think about what my loved ones will think when they read things I publish. Like, I try to publish things without keeping them in mind, which, by the way, is a rule he gave me when I was definitely too young a kid. Like, I remember being like my daughter's age, like 10 or so, and he said, like, well, look, when you grow up and you're writing things, you just need to don't worry about the feelings of the family or people just publish what you need to publish, and forget everything else. Like, is actually good advice artistically, not always good advice socially or maritally or whatever else. But this was my panic, was like, oh God, did I publish a poem about him that I completely forgot was in there? But no, he pointed to this poem called Hail and Farewell. Basically, I wrote it because I became obsessed with this Catullus poem. So I don't really do translations. I like old poems in other languages, and I read a couple different translations of them, and sometimes I just get them stuck in my head in a way that I find I need to exercise them. So there's a particular poem of Catullus's, Catullus 101, that I got stuck in my head. It is the poem from which we get the line or the motto "Aueatque vale," which means "Hail and Farewell." So when it would be sort of like if I titled a poem "Seize the Day," I would assume that anybody reading it would at least have that existing slogan and its source. Like theoretically, that would be in your mind if you saw that as the title of a poem. And so that was really truly what was in my mind when I called this poem Hail and Farewell, because it is not a translation of Catullus 101, but it is very much based on that poem. And basically, like, the gimmick of my poem is that I take Catullus 101, Aueatque vale, and I sort of blend it with the old Beatles song "Hello Goodbye," because it's the same like denotative meaning, hail and farewell, hello goodbye. And in the Catullus poem is basically it is addressed to his dead brother. His brother died. He had to travel a very long distance to get to his brother's grave, and he performs the requisite Roman funeral rites for his brother, and he makes the comment that he's sort of doing it, even it's like it's for his dad, for their dad, basically, that he's doing it, and it's so far away, and Catullus himself is not going to have a long life, that he accurately predicts that I'm not going to make it here again, that this is, for me, this is hail and farewell to you. So the last line in Latin is "Atque in perpetuum frater aueatque vale." So literally, and in perpetuity, brother, hail and farewell. So that's the end of the poem. And in my version, I refer to that song Dad liked, meaning the Paul McCartney, the Beatles song. And I throw in a couple lines from it, which I feel so almost confident that that's fair use that I've just basically like closed my eyes and believed that either it's fair use or my poetry matters so little that I'm not gonna get myself and Measure sued into oblivion. So I refer to Dad in that poem, and like, it's partly because Catullus refers to his father, the father of him and his brother in the poem 101, but it's also because it's like a playwright's shorthand. It's like a trick for letting the audience know about the relationship between two characters without saying, "You are my brother," which is not something brothers typically say to each other. So I threw that in there. My primary concern with the poem was that I do have a brother, and he's very much alive. He in fact supplied not only the art for this podcast, but the cover art for the book. He did design the whole jacket, which really does look. I mean, like I have certainly. I feel like I've received as many compliments on the jacket design as I have on the contents. But he did a really wonderful job with that design, and he is very alive and very healthy, which made me like slightly nervous publishing a poem about a dead brother. But it's not me. I mean, it's not me talking. So like my as soon as I understood which poem my dad was talking about, my immediate response was, "Oh, that's not about you." And then of course I had to like adjust slightly because that's not perfectly true. I mean, that is true, but where it's a little bit of a hedge or there's a little bit of there's a little blurriness is of course like he did like the Beatles. Like when he was 10 years old, he told me the story. Like he was sneaking downstairs or sneaking into whatever room had the TV, turning on the TV, keeping the volume as low as he could, and watching the Ed Sullivan Show where the Beatles made their big American debut and being, riveted by this performance on screen, and then having this sort of seminal, intimidating moment where his dad, who was a wonderful man, but also like a very old school, 1950s and 60s dad. He came in and he sat down behind, my dad was sitting cross-legged on the floor, and his dad came in and sat down behind him and didn't say anything at first, just watched the screen as he was. And then when the Beatles had finished their performance, he said, "Well, they've got something," which, like, I mean, I think he told it to me as a story about being a kid and being intimidated and then having this sort of slightly, like not getting in trouble when he expected to get in trouble, and it's a memory that stuck with him. But I think the other kind of quieter point of that anecdote, which I've really taken to heart, is that like my granddad did not like the Beatles. That was not his style of music. And when my dad and his brothers and sisters played their records in their room, it was not like my granddad really loved hearing that. He never really got the Beatles. It was never for him. But he could recognize that like two things were true. One was that a large number of people were having a very sincere response to this performance. And the other thing was just that this was not nothing. Like, it wasn't for him, but it wasn't just bullshit. Like, it wasn't just noise. Whatever you want to say about the Beatles, like, they've got something going on. And he was able to recognize that. And I think, like, I have come to respect that, the ability to do that more and more as I've gotten older, and as I have come to have that experience myself. Like, there's plenty of stuff I mean, I guess, like, on the one hand, there's like Rupi Kaur, which I actually do think is sort of nothing, but a lot of people do sincerely respond to it, and so I think there is the response is worth taking seriously, even if the poetry is not. And in other cases, maybe like Cameron's really into, I'm going to get it wrong because they're like 10 different rappers with like nearly identical names, but I believe it's Aesop Rock is the one he likes. And like, it's not music I would choose to listen to, but like, it is definitely like impressive. Like, there's definitely stuff going on there that is very impressively done. And I don't choose to listen to it, but I absolutely would not dismiss it. Like, it is very skillful, and there's something there. Anyway, I mentioned that anecdote because of course I did learn about the Beatles from my dad. He did like them, and he did sing, some of their songs, growing up. So in that sense, like that image of him, of the dad in the poem, was taken from my life, even though the character of the dad, as he's referred to in the poem, is not really the character of my dad, and it's certainly the relationships, with the brother and the death and all that. Like that's all Catullus. That's all his life. But it felt very natural to me, and like I have, whether or not my own poetry has merit, what I have found touching, and in an odd way, like not so surprising, is that the poets I know respond to those kind of, a lot of my poems have these sort of funny muddling of other sources and some original experience and some of my voice. And I talk with Mark McGinnis about anachronism, and how like anachronism is in some ways not just like a cute joke, but also a way to acknowledge the simultaneity of literary traditions. That like we are kind of all living in the same moment when we read and write. But what I was going to say is, like, when I've heard from other poets about like that poem and some other poems like it, they get what it is that is happening. Like they know the Catullus poem, but they also sort of it makes intuitive sense to them that these different realities are all getting blurred together. And this is where I think like the real truth about illusion lies. So with that poem, with a poem in there called Doubt in my book, and by the way, Midlife, available now from Measure Press. You can go to SLEERICKETS.com, where you will see links to everything involved with the show and with my work, and you will see a big shiny picture of the cover of Midlife. You just click on that and buy a copy from Bookshop, or you can go to Amazon, where it has I don't know, like at this point I'm kind of amused, because like I kind of like that, like it's got more ratings than any other book Measure's ever published and fewer cover images on the Amazon page. So come on. Anyway, buy it from Bookshop and then go rate it on Amazon just to spite them. Anyway, that's not Measure's fault. I am told it is Ingram's fault. So fuck you, Ingram Distributing. But not on behalf of Measure, only on behalf of me. Please, on behalf of Measure, go get your shit together. So in Midlife, there's Hail and Farewell. There's a poem called Drinking Ode, which I talked about with Mark McGinnis. There's a poem called Political Ode. There's a poem called Doubt. And then there are a couple others I mentioned in the acknowledgments. And in the acknowledgments, I mentioned it's like long acknowledgments. There's a lot to talk about. In there, I refer to those poems and their original sources, because Drinking Ode and Political Ode are loosely based on odes of Horace's, and Doubt is based on a poem of Catullus's, in which he was imitating a poem of Sappho's. And then, of course, Hail and Farewell is based on Catullus 101, as well as the Beatles song. In some of the published versions of those poems, I did the little thing where you say after Horace or something to that effect, as a little, line in italics, a little note in italics under the title. And in earlier versions of the book, I also included those notes. I finally took them out, and I have been ambivalent about that choice, but I felt so vindicated when I listened to the most recent episode of Poetry Says, because Alice, who is now a very like a great lover of Horace's, she's a great lover of Horace. If you're a lover, so she loves Horace's poetry. If she was a great lover of Horace's, that would mean she fucked Horace and was great at it, which she has not done, but if she did, I'm sure she would be. But no, she's now, she now is a great admirer of Horace's poetry, and is doing some of her own imitations and renderings of his work. But she noted what an impression I had from early on when I was reading poetry, and I sensed a lot of other people had, which was that when she initially saw poems that had a little note acknowledging some ancient poet under the title, she immediately felt distance from the poem. Like, best case scenario, she ignored that note, and sometimes she was just put off by that note and avoided the whole poem. So I took those notes out with in the same spirit that I took out a lot of the line breaks in many of the poems in the book. They're not in prose, but I did re-break a lot of the lines in the poems just to make them look less metrical, like purely to make them look less metrical. Like, I tried to then do a good job of sort of free verse line breaking them, but because I don't really believe in typographical line breaks, I basically, I mean, it's really just sort of like style. Like, it's really just to basically, like, I didn't want meter to get in the way of the reader. And similarly, I didn't want allusiveness to get in the way of the reader. Now, I think, again, if you are somebody who reads a fair amount of poetry, it would be very difficult to read any of those 4 poems I mentioned and not at least like have an inkling, like, oh, this is somebody. Like, in the Catullus Sappho poem, like, I referred both to Catullus like by name and Lesbia, which was I mean, so Catullus had a lover who was a society lady. She was married to a much more important person than Catullus. I believe her name was Clotilde or something, like some Latin version of that. But he obviously could not say her name in public, and so instead he referred to her as Lesbia, which we hear confusingly today because that is obviously linked to lesbian, the Isle of Lesbos, and our understanding of that term is purely sexual in nature. But for Catullus, it was just a tribute to Sappho. And in fact, for like many centuries, to call somebody a lesbian was what that chiefly meant was that you were saying he was a really good writer, because it evoked Sappho and Alcaeus, who were both lesbians. They were both from the Isle of Lesbos, even though Alcaeus was a man. But so Catullus refers to Sappho as Lesbia. I use both his name Lesbia and his own name Catullus in my poem. In the political ode, I include a bunch of Roman names, both gods and Romans contemporary to Catullus, or to Horace. And in Hail and Farewell, I mean, I think Hail and Farewell is such a well-known slogan, again, among poets, that I think if you are familiar with that set of, it's not even if you're familiar with that set of references, it's like if you swim in that water, you will recognize it. The same way that I think, again, I'm not a rap person, but if you listen to a lot of rap music, one of the things rappers do like constantly is pick up and throw in lines from classic rap songs. Like, it's an homage. It's a it's a way to pay tribute to the rappers they admire, but it's also almost just a way. It's like part of the common language. Like, when you write a really good line, it becomes part of the vocabulary of the community. And while poets are, seldom, not never, like Cleveland was wonderful, but like poets are seldom really good, like form really, really healthy communities in the real world while they're alive. The true community of poets is among the living and the dead and the not yet born. Right? And in that community, there is a common language, and that common language is largely made up of lines and allusions to and from existing work. And I think like this is the fine line. I think like it is very easy to alienate readers by cramming a bunch of references into a poem that let them know right away that they don't know enough, which is again why I took those little notes and acknowledgments out of the poems themselves. I put them in the acknowledgments of the book at the the front of the book, so you can find them there, including actually in with something else slightly else in mind. I included an acknowledgement of A.E. Stallings and of Ashley Anna McHugh, because there were poems that were not based on their poems, but poems in which I cryptoamnesia, if I remember, is the practice of stealing something and thinking you made it up. I stole either a line or a construction or like a near line from a poem of theirs. It was a poem of theirs from in Stallings' case, it was one of her underworld poems. It may have been one of her Persephone poems or one of her Eurydice poems. It's something to the effect of "down here all words begin to sound the same." I think that's my rendering of it. She has it's similar, but it's not quite the same. In a poem called Odysseus' Mother Greets Her Son in Hell, I include that line. It was only later that I realized, like, oh, I got it from her. So I acknowledged that, I basically said, like, this poem was inspired by her poem to some extent, and I put that in the acknowledgments at the front of the book. Similarly, in a poem called Sleeping Dogs, I have a line in the middle that goes, oh yeah. I talk about, like, I refer to some certainties that we don't talk about, and it's a poem about marriage. I mean, it is a poem about my marriage, about my my wife, though. With I mean, that one's actually, there's not really poetic license. Like, that one is pretty straight ahead, true to life. Like, the event, the central event in Sleeping Dogs did occur, and I actually don't think I took any factual liberties with that poem at all. Oh yeah, like, the only factual liberties I took were, I think I gave Joanna a key to a house that she doesn't actually have a key to, and I think that may have been about it. Like, I adjusted something like that to give myself a rule of threes list. But otherwise, that poem is actually very true to life. But I had this offhand line in the middle, some certainties that we don't talk about, referring to things in our marriage we kind of agree not to bring up. And I realized only later that there is, I think it may be the first line of "The clear unquarried blue of those depths is all but blinding." No, I think it's just called "The unquarried blue of those depths is all but blinding," which is a wonderful Ashley Anna McHugh poem. I've read it on the podcast before, and I believe the first line of that poem is, "There are some things we just don't talk about." And that is also a poem about, I think it's a marriage or a love affair. It's not totally clear. But again, that poem takes its title, and it's unacknowledged unless you read poetry, in which case it's immediately recognizable. That line of the title is borrowed with some modification from an Anthony Hecht poem. So, like, when I was trying to talk to my dad about all this, it, like, on the one hand, I felt guilty for like confusing or misleading him. And I certainly don't want to give people the impression that, like, my family members have died when they haven't. And I also don't want to take credit for things I didn't invent. But then, like, the more I thought about it, the more, like, this is an art form in which everything is borrowed. All of the words, all of the etymology of the words, the language itself, the context of the language, Donald Hall has that essay about how, like, metaphors have a progress they make from fresh to stale to dead to just idiomatic. Like at a certain point, a really, really dead metaphor just becomes language, because all language is fundamentally figurative. So, like, nothing in language is original. So nothing in poetry can be original. I am not a big believer in, like, hey, everything is just a remix. Everything is just an imitation. Like, actually, that doesn't quite ring true to me, because there is invention in poetry. There is creation. in poetry. But what is also true is that the allusiveness of it is not something added in. It's not something put on as a kind of a shibboleth to distinguish the initiates from the outsiders. It is part of the bargain. Like, I don't know. There was a line in the poem Elijah read at the Cleveland reading, and I may be misquoting it, but I believe the line was, "I cannot love what I cannot transform." I think that was the line. It was something very close to that, if not. And it was in a poem in which, like, it was impossible not to hear the allusions to other existing poems that he had clearly read and admired, but then also he was making his own claim on them. I think there is excess and there's deficiency, right? Like, I think in some cases Eliot may go a little too far with his references and allusions. I think there is a way to do it that's annoying and that is simply confusing and alienating. I think, like, my personal standard is, like, I don't want you to have to have read everything I've read to be able to enjoy the work. But on some level, I guess I think of it as common currency, like the same way that if you're a comedian, it is, or you're even like a prolific tweeter. It is just part of the air you breathe to make reference to pop culture, to contemporary slang, to current events. That this is understood to be something everybody has access to, something everybody possesses in common, and that is a useful set of terms and symbols that we can all reach for effortlessly. And I think the more time you spend in the stacks, the more time you spend with the dead guys, the more their old lines and their lines, in response to the guys who died before them and to the people who were not yet born, that all just becomes part of how you... It's not just that it becomes part of your vocabulary, it becomes part of your life. Like, I don't think poetry teaches you how to be a good person. Elijah and I very much disagree about that. We did argue a little bit at the reading about that. I don't think it teaches you how to be a good person. I don't think it supplies new wisdom. I've talked to Alice and to Jonathan about this a little bit recently, and like I think it does not solve problems, but it does offer consolation, or it can offer consolation. But it also becomes a way of understanding your own life. Like, I think, I've called Ryan my Virgil, which is obviously an allusion to the Divine Comedy, in which Dante is guided through hell by his personal poetic hero, Virgil. And in fact, much of the Divine Comedy is itself a tribute to Virgil and his own depiction of a journey through the underworld, in the Aeneid, among other sorts. I mean, I think he also has some like references to the oak tree and the Georgics and various other things. But when I refer to that, which is already in itself a complex allusion, it's not just that I am saying that for the benefit of people who like the Divine Comedy or who like Virgil. I mean, I'm saying that because it is part of how I understand my relationship with Ryan. Like, Borges says that Kafka invents his precursors. And I had a wonderful conversation with Katie Hartsock about that essay, actually, that'll be coming out soon. That like, before Kafka wrote what he wrote, the quality of the Kafkaesque that we find in the people he is, inspired by, that quality didn't exist in their work until he invented it. And so in that way, Kafka invents his precursors, and all great writers invent their precursors. But what's also true is that the it's not that Ryan was this thing for me, and then once, and then I picked up the reference to Virgil in order to signal to fancy poetry people that is what was happening. No, like, that allusion is part of what defined what the relationship is. I mean, the same way as my relationship to Jane, she's my mentor, and mentor, like, really in the kind of slightly narrow sense that it of the original. Like, she was the presence in which, these sort of ancient, sometimes godlike, sometimes capricious sources offered me some guidance for a little while. Like, and not all that much or all that long, but in a valuable way, that just as Athena does through the figure of mentor in for Telemachus. Like, mentorship in part is, like, exists as a thing because of that piece of writing. I don't want to get too, like, I don't know if I'm getting into, like, becoming Peter, what's his name? Fuck. Who's the annoying guy with the big puffy gray hair at Pinker? I can't remember if I'm becoming Steven Pinker or Noam Chomsky. I don't want to become either. But yeah, it's not that allusion is something that is added on to poetry. It is that it is part of the fabric of it. And it is, for me at least, and I think for a lot of poets I know, it becomes part of the fabric of our actual lives. Like, it would be difficult for us to understand what our lives are without allusion. And so when it comes up in the poetry, it's not a signal, it's not a barrier, it's part of the thing itself. All right, I'm gonna have to break off here, take Echo to the groomer, and then when I come back, I have a couple poems I will read. Not my own, I promise. Though again, like, if I am very reluctant to talk about my own poetry. If there are specific things about the book or questions, or that any of you would like to hear about, I would be happy to answer those questions. I mean, also do write in questions in general I want to do another AMA with, if I can, all four of us. So send in questions about whatever, including, if you want to ask questions about midlife, you're welcome to. Also, just go buy it and read it, and give it an Amazon rating. And if you work at Ingram, give it a fucking cover image too, please. All right, more in a second. All right, so there's a poem I want to get to in a minute, but I think there's a maybe too nebulous point worth returning to. I think nebulous point is probably a pretty clear contradiction in terms, but with the Catullus poem, like, as I said, like I am borrowing from my own memories of my dad, listening to the Beatles, talking about the Beatles, singing, songs of theirs when I was growing up. But also, I don't have a dead brother, and the whole relationship among the three of us with rituals and all that, like, that's different. It's like the way the speaker of the poem talks about family is not quite the way I would talk about family in most cases. So it is Catullus speaking. It's not me, but I think, like, there are a couple of different kinds of poems that, like, there's I think it's Jackson Matthews has a thing, and I talked to Chris Childress a little bit about this. Another really good episode that I'm going to be releasing soon. He is a really accomplished, like, maybe the most accomplished translator of my generation. He very much defied this suggestion by, I think Jackson Matthews, that when a living poet translates another poet's work, a dead poet particularly, into his own, into the living poet's tongue, part of what is happening is he kind of recognizes something kindred in say the dead poet's work. Like, he recognizes something of himself. He sees, like, maybe under different circumstances in another world, in another culture, life, or time, I might have written a poem like this, and so I'm drawn to this particular poem. He is much more professional about his approach to translation, and I think he's probably right. But again, I'm not a translator. So for me, when I do an imitation of a poem, or when I respond to a poem, or like there's another poem I read in Cleveland that is basically there's a Leopardi poem called A se stesso, to himself, that Ryan showed me, and I loved it so much that I wanted to translate it, and then my translation attempts were so bad that I just ended up writing like a sort of it's like a parallel poem, the poem that sort of is on a similar subject with some of the same vague, like some of the same tropes and images, speaking directly to the poet, speaking to his heart, as the original, and then doing my own dumb contemporary American thing with the poem instead of the classic Leopardi thing. But I think for me, even with with the Horace poem, Posthumous 214, the Horace Ode 214 to Posthumous that I talked about with Mark McGinnis, that was a poem I very much connected with it on an immediate level. Like, it felt like the things Horace was saying to his friend were things I could say to my friend in a way that felt, true to the moment. And if somebody read that speaker as me, he wouldn't be totally wrong. Whereas he would be basically wrong if he read the speaker of Hail and Farewell as me, except because I'm not a real translator, because I'm not Chris Childers, because I'm not really translating, I'm kind of playing or responding, or, I do a lot of different things. Like, there's another poem, I get I don't know, this is like, maybe the word for this is pastiche. There's another poem in there called Archaic Torso of Aphrodite. Again, if you are a person who reads poetry, it's going to be very clear that title is borrowing from Rilke's Archaic Torso of Apollo. My dad, who saw the sculpture I was actually basing that poem on, was very quick to point out that it's actually a Hellenic torso of Aphrodite, but I felt free to take a little bit of poetic license there. That's not an imitation or translation of Rilke, but it does quote Rilke and responds in part to him. And borrows the same form, which is just a sonnet anyways. It's not that shocking or new. When I borrow from a poem or take something from a poem or feel compelled to write toward a poem or into a poem that already exists, it is sometimes because it feels very immediate. Like the Catullus poem that is also the Sappho poem, when I did that rendering of it, it was in the same circumstances in which I wrote last call at the conference hotel, right? Like, it was there was at least an element of autobiography to it, even if it was on a purely psychological level. Bonus points if you can name the poet in Last Call at the Conference Hotel, which you probably can if you listen to this podcast. Like, so there are cases in which it's a sort of a ventriloquism, like Jean Améry? No, Jean Améry is the philosopher who was tortured at Auschwitz. There's Jean Ennui. Ennui. If I spoke French, I would know how to distinguish between his last name and ennui, the concept, the emotion. But Ennui, the French playwright who translated Antigone during the Nazi occupation of Paris. He was in Paris. He translated and produced this play under the Nazis, and it is Sophocles' Antigone. But also, if you are living there under the Nazis and you hate them like Jean Ennui did, then it is pretty clear that that sentiment is represented in the play, that it is a play about unreasonable tyranny. Though it's also a play in which, like, the tyrant is given a pretty humane treatment. Like, Creon is a fairly convincing, like, you're not won over to his cause, but I think you certainly find him understandable in a way that you would not you wouldn't necessarily expect given the context. But I think, like, there are cases where you're just sort of borrowing another poet's poem as an opportunity, as like a ventriloquist dummy, or I use the term stalking horse, and then when the very smart woman I was using it with asked me what it meant, I guessed myself. I second guessed myself. But yeah, okay, all right, I'm not wrong. All right, so a stalking horse is an excuse for something you wanted to do anyway, or sometimes it's like the people will talk about a stalking horse candidate. It's often used in political context where somebody will set forth a candidate who is not really representing his own interests, but is actually representing the interests of somebody who has not yet revealed himself. I think it's a hunting term. It's a sort of a way to disguise yourself from the prey. All of which is to say, sometimes a poem in translation or a poem in imitation can serve that purpose. I think even Roy Fuller, who is not actually translating a poem in his poem translation, is taking that the context of translation as a kind of a blind for his true interests, or like as an opportunity to express some thoughts that might be impolitic to express. The real poem in midlife that is imitating translation, if anything, is Carmen Barbarorum, which was actually published by Chris Childers in the little the Classical Outlook, I think is a magazine he edits. He edits the contemporary poetry for that magazine. He helped me with the Latin of the title. The Song of the Barbarians is what the title means, and that one is more of just like a stalking horse for me. But there are other cases, and the Catullus poem is an example of this, in which the poem is not really representing something I know right now, but in the same way that when poets, like I sit here, I'm surrounded by books in this little room where I record this, and there's just stacks of books of poetry and reference books and novels and philosophy books and all sorts of things all around me, and they're from all different eras. I mean, they're from spanning thousands of years and different continents, and yet they all have a kind of a simultaneity because they're all here with me right now. And in the same way that all of these poets, not just that the poets are from different places and times, but they're from their own different parts. They're different parts of their own lives. Like even, as Alice points out, like even Horace's Odes is not just one Horace. It's actually spanning quite a big stretch of time in his life. In that same way, for me, when I write a poem, particularly if it's a poem that's in some kind of dialogue with existing poetry, my sense is that I'm writing it not just for me right now. And so, although I'm very grateful not to be able to relate directly to Catullus's poem, I'm a little bit scandalized by the thought that, like, oh God, does somebody think that, like, is somebody going to be moved by this poem because he thinks my brother died? In which case that feels like, oh, that feels shitty. Like, you want the poem to have an effect on people, but you don't want the effect to be it's like the really having happenedness of its content. I mean, at least I don't want that. So like that gives me the heebie-jeebies a little bit. But what's also true is that like I'm not just borrowing that poem in order to put my spin on this thing that doesn't have to do with me. Like when I give a rendering of it, my thought is this doesn't have to do with me yet. Like this isn't something I can relate to yet. But just as when I read Catullus, I have his whole life at once. I mean, relatively short life, but like I have all of his work, all of his life that has survived all at once at hand. And like he lived it in order. Right? He lived it. That was the Kierkegaard line that they used for the Benjamin Button movie. Life can only be understood backwards. It must be lived forwards. So like he lived his life moment by moment, day by day, poem by poem. But also, if you're writing into this long and broad tradition, then you understand like your work is going to be kind of telescoped in that same way. And yeah, like this poem doesn't represent me in my experience now, but it certainly will. And like maybe because I will play the role that Catullus played, but maybe because I'll play the role that the brother played, or maybe I'll play the role that the dad played. So when I, sometimes I pick up a poem because it just speaks directly to how I am feeling right now. But sometimes I pick it up because it rings true in a slightly eerier way. feels like, oh, this will be the case for me. Or this is true in a way that is not irrelevant to my life. It's just not relevant to my life yet. So, all right. So with that in mind, and I hope my life isn't ever perfectly relevant to this next poem, but I mentioned that Alice did an episode on Horace Ode 4.1, which is in the Fairy translation is addressed to Venus. She reads a few different translations, and I agree with her. I think the J.D. McClatchy translation, which is fairly loose, is excellent. I think it's quite lovely, and I for one look forward to reading her version, or whatever it ends up being. It reminded me, because it is a poem in which Horace is saying, God damn it, why am I in love again? It's so shitty to be in love. Once upon a time when I was younger, I was in love with Sinara. He probably would have said Kainara, this girl, and that was suitable when I was like, she was young, I was young. It all made sense then. I'm 50 now. I don't need to be in love with this Ligurinas. It seems to be a young man, but there's a little bit of ambiguity. I mean, there's often a little bit of ambiguity about sex and gender with Horace. Horace seemed to like to have a good time, and he didn't seem to be super picky about who he had a good time with. He certainly he gives that advice to others who like to Phyllis. He says, don't be too picky about having a good time with me, because the hot young thing you're into, he's not into you. But yeah, so he's angry at being torn up by love again. And, I think maybe he may tell love to go bother Ligurinas instead. But anyway, the early in the poem, there is a line, or it's over the course of 2 lines. He says, non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Cinarae. So, I am not as I was under the reign of good Cinara, I think is basically the meaning of that sentence. Non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Cinarae. I am not as I was under the reign of good Cinara. Back in the day, when that was the person I was in love with, things were different. Now I'm a fucking mess. And that sentence from Horace's 4.1 is the actual title of the poem that is usually just referred to as Cinara or Sinara by Ernest Townsend, who is probably most famous for the utterly immortal 8-line Dagger to the Heart, which also has a title that's a line from a sentence from a Horace poem. That has a title from Horace 1.11, the Carpe Diem poem, and the title, if I remember, is Vitae summa brevi spemnos vetat inquare longam. I think I talked about this poem. Vitae summa brevi spemnos vetat inquire longam. Yeah, so I've talked about this poem on the podcast before. I believe the title translates very, very loosely to life is too short for long hopes. Something, that is not precisely what it means. Translators, don't get on me, but that is my very loose translation of the title. That poem, very quickly, is they are not long the weeping and the laughter, love and desire and hate. I think they have no portion in us after we pass the gate. They are not long the days of wine and roses. Out of a misty dream our path emerges for a while, then closes within a dream. Just like slam the gate of the piano keys, go home, you're done. That is the coinage of the phrase, the days of wine and roses, by the way. Just as this poem, Sinara, is the coinage of the phrase, Gone with the Wind. I am 95% sure that's true. Let me double check that. I'm 95% sure that this is where Gone with the Wind comes from. It is not, however, about an antebellum damsel or a roguish sometime like a roguishly charming sometimes clansman, as I believe the Rhett Butler character was in the original book. Yes, okay. The title is taken from Non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Cinarae. So this is a longer poem by Dowson. It's probably his other really well-known poem. It is where the phrase "Gone with the Wind" comes from, and it is. I love it partly because it sort of it wobbles on the tightrope between viciously cynical and weepily sentimental. Like it sort of dips into both of those extremes at times. But he was a decadent. What did you expect? What do you expect? All right, this is Sonara. It is not, by the way, really an imitation or translation of Horace's Ode. It has a different course of argument, but it is, in this case, about basically a man who was in love with this woman, Sonara, who is, just as Catullus used Lesbia as a pseudonym or nom de guerre for his lover. There's got to be a word for nom de sex rather than guerre or pen or whatever, plume. So he's presumably, my assumption is that Dowson actually was in love with this woman he's talking about, but he's calling her Sonara rather than whatever her real name is, just as Catullus called his lover, Lesbia. He was in love with her. He's not with her anymore. And we learn, it takes a second for us to learn precisely the context, but he is turned to the comforts of another woman. And yet he can't forget Sonara. She remains everywhere, in his days and nights. And he has this sort of wonderful, contradictory refrain, I have been faithful to the Sonara in my fashion. As we will learn, that is a very specific fashion. It is not the conventional fashion in which one might say, I've been faithful to thee. It reminds me a little bit of the great lesbian anthem, Back in Your Head by Tegan and Sara, in which the part of the refrain is, if I remember, I'm not unfaithful, but I strayed, which is could basically just be taken from a Dowson poem. Did I fuck this other girl? Sure. Was I unfaithful to you? Never. Not in my fashion. All right. So this is Sonara, this is not Sonara. This is non sum qualis This is non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Cinarai by Ernest Dowson. I am not as I was under the reign of good Sonara. Last night, yesternight, betwixt her lips and mine, there fell thy shadow, Sonara. Thy breath was shed upon my soul between the kisses and the wine, and I was desolate and sick of an old passion. So far, we're tipping pretty far toward sentimentality, and maybe all the way into sentimentality. But let's keep going. Last night, yesternight, betwixt her lips and mine, there fell thy shadow, Sonara. Thy breath was shed upon my soul between the kisses and the wine, and I was desolate and sick of an old passion. Yea, I was desolate and bowed my head. I have been faithful to thee, Sonara, in my fashion. All night upon mine heart I felt her warm heart beat. Night long within mine arms in love and sleep she lay. Surely the kisses of her bought red mouth were sweet, but I was desolate and sick of an old passion. I love that, obviously the word screaming out of that stanza is bought, but in context, the actual line in which it appears is an insistent that and of course it was sweet, it was lovely. Of course I have no complaints about her bought red mouth, but it is it strikes our ear a little differently when we are prepared for a very sentimental love poem about an old love. All right, I'll start over and I won't interrupt myself this time. Last night, yesternight, betwixt her lips and mine, there fell thy shadow, Sonara. Thy breath was shed upon my soul between the kisses and the wine, and I was desolate and sick of an old passion. Yea, I was desolate and bowed my head. I have been faithful to thee, Sonara, in my fashion. All night upon mine heart I felt her warm heart beat. Night long within mine arms in love and sleep she lay. Surely the kisses of her bought red mouth were sweet, but I was desolate and sick of an old passion. When I awoke and found the dawn was gray, I have been faithful to thee, Sonara, in my fashion. I have forgot much, Sonara. Gone with the wind, flung roses riotously with the throng, dancing to put thy pale lost lilies out of mind. but I was desolate and sick of an old passion. Yea, all the time, because the dance was long, I have been faithful to thee, Cynara, in my fashion. I cried for madder music and for stronger wine. But when the feast is finished and the lamps expire, then falls thy shadow, Cynara. The night is thine, and I am desolate and sick of an old passion. Yea, hungry for the lips of my desire, I have been faithful to thee, Cynara, in my fashion. I won't try to, give too long reading this one, partly because I'm going to have to take my girls to their various appointments soon. But that second to last stanza, I mean, it's the three sestets, but then there's a quatrain at the beginning and a two lines non-couplet stanza at the end, so it's not real regular. I'm not going to break down the rhyme scheme. There are semi-regular rhymes and meter with a lot of variations within the meter. But it's all quite clean. It may not be quite as perfectly clean as the Witasuma Brois, but it's not metrically. There's no prosodic radicalism here. But that second to last stanza is, for my money, like the real heart of the poem. The bought red mouth in the second stanza, it definitely helps set the tone, but it's this second to last stanza that actually made me, when I was rereading it today, I thought, is this where, okay, so Joshua Megan's poem that I know has been seared into Alice's mind and my own and plenty of other people's for, ever since we first read it, the Cold Turkey, the great Joshua Megan poem about quitting booze, in which he never mentions anything about booze directly. I know in that poem that he, or at least I assumed that he had in mind, at least in part, Alkmund's old poem, which I'm going to include a link to because A. Stallings did a wonderful translation of it. It was published in Poetry Magazine, and yet they don't include it under her list of work there, and so it's almost impossible to fucking find, and it takes me like 20 minutes to find it every time I try to Google it. So I'm going to include a link to it in this episode's show notes so you can find it easily. She just calls it Halcyon. I don't think it's titled by Alkmund. But it's a very short poem in which he basically is saying, like, I'm too old to dance with all those dancing girls, but boy, I miss it. And he refers to the myth of the kingfisher and the halcyon, which is, of course, taken from the story of Ceyx and Alcyone, the king and queen, who he died and she mourned for him, and then they were both transformed into birds. And for part of the year, he rides on her wings, and then during the halcyon days, the sea calms, and it's like summer, even though it should be cold and bitter outside, and it's because the halcyon bird is sitting on the waves, floating. Yeah, very, very little biology or ornithology, but lots of myth in that story. So this is Halcyon, translated by Alkmund. This is Halcyon by Alkmund, translated by A. Stallings for Alan Anson. She had a really lovely translator's note about this guy, Alan Anson. That's also really hard to fucking find, so I don't know. But here's here's her translation of the Alkmund poem. It's very short. O girls who sing so honey sweet and true, my dancing days are through. My limbs don't have the strength to carry me. If only I could be a cerulean bird that flew with the kingfishers over the bloom of the wave, heart unflinching, brave, spring's sacred bird, as purple as the sea. So that poem, I feel moderately, not necessarily in Stallings' translation of it, but the original poem, God all fucking mighty by Alkmund. Google does not want to work for me. So yeah, I don't know about the Stallings translation, but I assume that the Alkmund poem was at least some of what was in Josh's mind when he wrote this poem. I've read it on the podcast before, but it's very short. I'll read it again. They are over now forever, the long dances. Our woods are quiet. The god is gone tonight. Our girls, good girls, have shaken off their trances. They're over now forever, the long dances. Only the moonlight, sober and real, advances over our hills to touch my head with white. They're over now forever, the long dances. Our woods are quiet. The god is gone tonight. If you listen to this podcast, you surely already know, but another nice little little, author's bio, real life touch is that, of course, just as the moonlight, touches the head of the speaker in the poem and covers it with white light, Josh also, his hair turned very, very silver white, at a very young age. So it's a nice little biographical touch there. But I assume in his mind was the Alchemin poem. And then rereading the Dowson poem, I thought maybe this poem was as well. By the way, another very, very brief side note. I won't say any more than this, but Literary Matters, which is probably going to die, before it dies, it's going to have a really good last issue. And included in that issue will be 2 new translations by Joshua Megan. So they're very good. I'm very excited. There's probably my favorite of the 2 is a really good Borges translation. But and like I can't remember if I mentioned, but like in New York, he read a new poem of his I had not ever read before. That boy, that was really good as well. So that'll be coming out somewhere else. 2 new translations coming out in Literary Matters. A lot of good new work from Josh. Or a lot. Like, it's like the Joyce joke, like where Joyce is crying on the floor of his studio and his friend comes by at the end of the day and says, like, "What's wrong, James?" And he says, "I only wrote 7 words today." And his friend says, "But that's good for you, James." And the punchline is, I don't know what order they go in. But yeah, like three new, publications from Joshua Megan. That's a flood. That's a wealth. It's very exciting. So I did rereading this poem, as I said, I thought maybe this stanza might have been in his mind as well. "Yea, all the time, because the dance was long, I have been faithful to thee, Sonara, in my fashion." Something about the specificity of "because the dance was long." And the contradiction, like if anything, because the dance was long, you would think he would not be faithful. But his kind of faith works a little differently. "Yea, all the time, because the dance was long, I have been faithful to thee, Sonara, in my fashion. I cried for madder music and for stronger wine." And madder music and stronger wine feel like they are in the background of Cold Turkey, even if they're not mentioned explicitly. "I cried for madder music and for stronger wine, but when the feast is finished and the lamps expire, then falls thy shadow." Again, a little bit of a contradiction. When there's not light to cast shadow anymore, but everything falls into shadow, that's when Sonara's shadow arrives. "Then falls thy shadow, Sonara. The night is thine, and I am desolate and sick of an old passion." All right, enough of that. I do have to run to take my girls to their various places, but yeah, just like a lot of kind of related thoughts all colliding in my mind lately, and I thought I would set them down and mostly send you to go listen to Alice's episode on Horace 4.1. Also, yeah, thank you to all of you who came to Cleveland. I am going to be, there's going to be some other stuff coming up. I can't announce all of it yet, but I'm hoping to make it back up to New York, and there will be, I will, with luck, it hasn't been 100% confirmed, but I'm supposed to be in DC doing something fun there. A little bit, into the fall. There'll be some other stuff coming up as well with luck. But thanks you all for listening, and go check out, if you have not yet, The Secret Show at SLEERICKETS.substack.com, or just go to SLEERICKETS.com. All the links are there. And yeah. Oh, and you can reach me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. Do write me with any questions, complaints, or rants. I get a lot of monologues in the email, which is, it's nice. It's nice to read. So you can reach me there, SLEERICKETS@gmail.com, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.